At 7 p.m. on May 25, 2006, a phone call was placed from Everest Base Camp to a quiet home in the Blue Mountains of Australia. The message was brief, devastating, and absolute. Lincoln Hall, one of the most celebrated mountaineers in Australian history, was dead. He had collapsed at 700 meters while descending from the summit. For 2 hours, his Sherpas had tried to revive him. They had watched him stop breathing. They had watched his eyes glaze over. Under direct orders from the expedition leader at base camp, they had abandoned his body to save their own lives. Barbara Hall, Lincoln's wife, began the grueling process of telling their 2 teenage sons that their father was never coming home. The news hit the global wires instantly. The 2006 climbing season had already been stained by death, and Lincoln Hall was now the 11th casualty. But 12 hours later, a second phone call came. It defied every known law of high-altitude physiology. Lincoln Hall wasn't dead. He had been found sitting on the edge of a 10,000-foot drop, his suit unzipped to his waist, his hat and gloves gone, calmly trying to change his shirt in minus 30-degree temperatures. This is not just a story of a miraculous survival. This is a deep-dive investigation into a sequence of decisions that should have ended in a funeral. It is a dissection of the moment a world-class climber mocked a direct warning from a man who knew the mountain better than he did. We are going to explore the names, the faces, and the specific choices that led to Lincoln Hall being left for dead, and why his survival actually sparked one of the most bitter ethical wars in the history of mountaineering. To understand why Lincoln Hall was abandoned, we have to look at the people involved. This wasn't a group of amateurs. Lincoln Hall was a legend. He had been part of the first Australian expedition to Everest in 1984. He was a man who helped forge the very route he was now climbing. But by 2006, the mountain had changed. It had become a commercial enterprise, and Lincoln was returning as part of the Seven Summits Club, an expedition led by Alexander Abramov. Alongside Lincoln was a diverse group, each with their own reasons for being on the ridge. There was Thomas Weber, a German climber who was legally blind. Weber's presence on the mountain is a critical, often overlooked part of this tragedy. He was attempting to become the first visually impaired person to summit from the north side. He was accompanied by his personal guide, Harry Kickstra. Then there was the Sherpa team, led by men like Dawa Tenzing, who had summited Everest multiple times and possessed an innate, almost supernatural ability to read the oxygen levels in a man's blood just by looking at his gait. The conventional narrative of 2006 focuses almost entirely on the miracle of Lincoln Hall's survival. But the miracle obscures a darker truth. That season, the climbing community was already reeling from the death of David Sharp, a British climber who had been passed by 40 people as he lay dying in a cave, just hours before Lincoln's own crisis. The world was asking, has Everest lost its soul? Are we now leaving people to die because a summit is worth more than a life? In this documentary, we are going to reconstruct the timeline of May 25th with surgical precision. We will examine the moment Lincoln Hall looked Dawa Tenzing in the eye and dismissed a warning that would have saved him from a night of permanent brain damage. We will look at the medical reality of high-altitude cerebral edema, the silent killer that turns a genius into a toddler in a matter of minutes. And we will investigate the order given by Alexander Abramov, the order to leave a man behind. Was Lincoln actually dead when they left him? Or did the Sherpas, exhausted and running out of oxygen themselves, see what they needed to see to justify their own descent? The testimonies from that night are conflicting, haunted by the effects of hypoxia and the crushing weight of survival instinct. We will hear the accounts of the 4 Sherpas who were with him: Sangai, Penba, Jangbu, and Lakpa. They were the ones who had to make the choice. They were the ones who had to look at a man they respected and decide that his life was no longer worth the risk of theirs. But Lincoln wasn't the only one who didn't make it back to camp that night. Thomas Weber, the blind climber, would also reach his breaking point on that same ridge. The tragedy of Lincoln Hall is inextricably linked to the death of Thomas Weber, yet in the media frenzy that followed, Weber's story was nearly erased. We will bring his story back to the forefront. We will look at the pressure of film crews, the ego of expedition leaders, and the fatal intersection of ambition and disability. What we are uncovering here is a chain of events where every link was a human error. From the timing of the summit push, to the management of oxygen bottles, to the psychological breakdown of a man who thought he was invincible. Lincoln Hall's survival was a statistical impossibility. but his collapse was entirely predictable. We will investigate the hidden truths of the Seven Summits expedition. We will look at the lawsuits and the verbal attacks that followed. We will explore the guilt that haunted the rescuers and the bitterness of the families who felt the miracle of one man highlighted the unnecessary death of others. The questions we are asking are uncomfortable. If Lincoln Hall hadn't been a famous climber, would anyone have stopped for him the next morning? If he hadn't been found by a team led by Dan Mazur, a man with a legendary moral compass, would he be just another frozen marker on the North Ridge today? How did a man go from confirmed dead to writing a memoir about his own passing? To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning of the summit push, to the moment the first warning was issued and ignored. Before we go to the next chapter, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are documenting where these accounts are reaching and at what moments, day or night, they are being heard. Before we move forward, I want to ask you to subscribe and become a member of this channel. Do this so you never miss moments like this. Moments where the truth is told calmly, clearly, and without distortion. If 1,000 of you are watching right now, I hope all 1,000 choose to join us because this community is growing and your presence here genuinely matters. So, Chapter 2, Asterisk. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on the North Ridge, you have to understand the man who believed he was immune to the mountain's lethality. Lincoln Hall was not a novice. In the world of high-altitude mountaineering, he was royalty. In 1984, he had been a key member of the first Australian expedition to Everest, a legendary climb that saw his teammates reach the summit via a grueling new route on the north face without supplemental oxygen. Lincoln himself had come within a few hundred meters of the top that year but had turned back. For 22 years, that unfinished business had simmered. By 2006, Lincoln was 50 years old, a father to 2 teenage sons, Barney and Dylan, and a husband to Barbara. He was a philosopher of the peaks, a man who had written books about the spiritual nature of climbing. But he was also a man who carried the quiet arrogance of a survivor. He had survived the Great Couloir in his 20s. Surely the standard North Ridge route in his 50s would be well within his grasp. This return to Everest wasn't just a personal quest, it was a professional one. Lincoln was there as the expedition's media coordinator, tasked with documenting the journey of Thomas Weber, a 41-year-old German climber with a story that was arguably more compelling and more dangerous than Lincoln's. Thomas Weber was legally blind. Years earlier, a brain tumor had stripped him of most of his sight, leaving him with only a fraction of his vision. He wanted to prove that disability was not a barrier to the world's highest point. He had partnered with Harry Kickstra, an experienced guide and filmmaker, to document Vision 2006. The red flags, however, were present long before they reached the death zone. Thomas's condition was not stable. At high altitudes, the lack of oxygen doesn't just affect the lungs. It affects the brain and the optic nerves. During the acclimatization rotations, Harry Kickstra noticed that Thomas's vision would fluctuate wildly. There were moments when he was almost entirely blind, relying on the sound of Harry's boots or the feel of the fixed rope to navigate. Yet, the drive to reach the summit fever that blinds even the most clear-sighted men, kept them moving upward. Thomas was a man of immense will, but he was also a man trapped in a body that was sending him silent neurological warnings. Lincoln Hall, meanwhile, was experiencing his own shift in perspective. As he moved through the higher camps, the physical toll of his age began to show. He was slower than the younger climbers, but he compensated with a deep, internal confidence. He had spent decades lecturing on the psychology of risk. He believed he knew exactly where his limit was. This is the deadliest trap on Everest. The belief that your past experience is a shield against your current reality. Lincoln's 1984 success had been built on raw, youthful power. The 2006 attempt was being built on nostalgia and a refusal to acknowledge that a 50-year-old brain reacts differently to extreme hypoxia than a 28-year-old one. The expedition was managed by Alexander Abramov's Seven Summits Club. Abramov was known for running a tight, highly successful ship, but the 2006 season was chaotic. The mountain was crowded, and the ethics of the climbing community were being stretched to the breaking point. At base camp, Lincoln and Thomas were surrounded by people who were there to check a box. The camaraderie of the 1984 expedition was gone. replaced by a commercialized atmosphere where clients paid tens of thousands of dollars to be escorted to the top. This environment creates a subtle, toxic pressure. When you are the media man or the inspirational blind climber, the pressure to perform for the cameras and the sponsors is immense. You aren't just climbing for yourself. You are climbing for a narrative. The Sherpa team, led by Dawa Tenzing, watched these two men closely. Dawa was a veteran who had seen the look in a climber's eyes, the vacant, glassy stare that precedes a total system collapse. He noticed that Lincoln was pushing himself harder than was wise for a man of his years. He noticed that Thomas's coordination was fraying, but in the commercial world of Everest, a Sherpa's warning is often viewed as, quote, overcaution. Clients who have paid $40,000 don't want to hear that they should turn back because they look a little tired. Quote, for Thomas Weber, the stakes were even higher. He had made a promise to his family and his supporters that he would be safe, but he had also tied his entire identity to this summit. His guide, Harry Kickstra, was in a difficult position. He was a friend, a filmmaker, and a guide all at once. The boundaries of his responsibility were blurred. If Thomas said he could see well enough to continue, who was Harry to tell him otherwise? This ambiguity would prove fatal. Back in Australia, Barbara Hall waited for the scheduled check-ins. She knew Lincoln better than anyone. She knew that behind the calm, intellectual exterior was a man who hated to fail. She had watched him prepare for months, trekking through the Blue Mountains with a heavy pack, obsessed with the idea of finally standing on that summit. He had promised her he would take no unnecessary risks. He had promised his sons he would be back for their school events. But the version of Lincoln Hall that made those promises was a man who had plenty of oxygen. The version of Lincoln Hall that would arrive at 700 meters would be a different person entirely. The tragedy of the 2006 season was that it was populated by survivors. Men who had survived so much in their lives that they believed they were the protagonists of a story that couldn't end in a senseless death. Thomas Weber had survived a brain tumor. He believed the mountain would respect that strength. Lincoln Hall had survived the golden age of Australian climbing. He believed his expertise was a suit of armor. But the mountain doesn't care about your biography. It doesn't care about your unfinished business or your Vision 2006 project. It only cares about the physics of your blood and the chemistry of your brain. As the team moved into Camp 3, preparing for the final push, the group was already fractured by hidden physical failures. Thomas was losing his sight. Lincoln was losing his judgment. And the Sherpas were beginning to realize that they were no longer guides. They were soon to be pallbearers. The most chilling aspect of this before period was the silence of the experts. There were dozens of experienced climbers at base camp who saw the state of the Seven Summits team. They saw the blind man struggling on the ropes. They saw the aging veteran moving with a heavy, leaden stride. Yet, the culture of Everest is one of non-interference. You don't tell another team their client is going to die. You mind your own business and focus on your own summit. This silence is the vacuum in which disasters are born. As May 24th turned into May 25th, the summit push began. The air was thin, the temperature was dropping, and the ego-driven momentum of the expedition was now an unstoppable force. Thomas Weber and Harry Kickstra were moving upward. Lincoln Hall and his 4 Sherpas were moving upward. They were all stepping into a trap that had been set weeks ago, during the very first days of their preparation. They had prioritized the summit over the warning signs, the narrative over the reality, and the past over the present. What they didn't know was that higher up the ridge, another man, David Sharp, was already dying in a cave, his tragedy serving as a grim foreshadowing of what was about to happen to them. The decisions that would lead to Lincoln's collapse and Thomas's death were being made in real time under the guise of determination. But as any experienced high-altitude doctor will tell you, there is a very fine line between determination and a death wish. But Lincoln Hall didn't know what was already happening higher on the mountain. He didn't know that within hours his ability to speak, to think, and to recognize his own name would be stripped away by the very mountain he thought he had mastered. Chapter 3, Asterix. The transition from a controlled climb to a fatal disaster began with a single conversation at 300 meters. On the evening of May 24th, inside the cramped, oxygen-depleted tents of Camp 3, Sherpa Dawa Tenzing pulled Lincoln Hall aside. Dawa had been watching Lincoln for days. He noticed the way Lincoln's hands fumbled with his oxygen regulator, a task that should have been second nature. He saw a slight, almost imperceptible lag in Lincoln's response to questions. To the untrained eye, Lincoln looked like any other exhausted climber. To Dawa, Lincoln looked like a man whose brain was starting to leak fluid. Dawa told Lincoln plainly, "You should not go. You stay here. You go down tomorrow." Lincoln's reaction was not one of concern, but of dismissive amusement. He laughed. He told Dawa he was being, quote, overcautious, a mother hen. He pointed to his decades of experience and his successful acclimatization. In Lincoln's mind, Dawa was just being a conservative guide, trying to manage a client's ego. But this was the first fatal decision. The mockery of that warning was the sound of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, beginning its work. In the early stages of HACE, the victim often experiences euphoria and a sense of invulnerability. Lincoln wasn't just being stubborn. His brain was already physically incapable of processing the danger it was in. He chose to push forward, dismissing the only man on the mountain who was truly reading the situation. Simultaneously, a second crisis was escalating in the tent next door. Thomas Weber, the legally blind climber, was experiencing a total collapse of his remaining vision. At 300 meters, the lack of oxygen had caused the blood vessels in his eyes to hemorrhage further. He was effectively in a blackout. His guide, Harry Kickstra, was now faced with an impossible ethical choice. Thomas had spent years and thousands of dollars to get to this point. He was telling Harry that his vision would clear up once they started moving and the adrenaline kicked in. It was a lie born of desperation, and Harry, caught in the momentum of the expedition, chose to believe it. They decided to begin their summit push alongside Lincoln's team. The clock hit 11 p.m. This is the point of no return on the North Ridge. To summit and return safely, you must be moving by midnight. The two teams stepped out into the darkness of the death zone. As they ascended toward the first step, the escalation was rapid. Lincoln was moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. He was using oxygen at a rate that was significantly higher than planned because his lungs were struggling to compensate for his failing neurological state. Every breath he took was a gamble against his remaining supply. His Sherpas, Sangay and Penba, noticed he was becoming increasingly silent, a stark contrast to his jovial mockery of the night before. They reached the second step, a vertical rock face at 600 meters, at 6 a.m. They were already 2 hours behind schedule. In any other circumstance, a 2-hour delay at this altitude is a mandatory turnaround signal. But the summit was visible. The weather was clear. The sunk cost fallacy took hold of the entire group. They had come too far to stop now. While Lincoln struggled with the rock, Thomas Weber was living a nightmare. He was climbing the second step almost entirely by touch. Harry Kickstra was shouting directions, telling him where to place his boots on the metal ladder. It was a scene of pure, terrifying chaos. Other climbers passing them later reported that Thomas looked like a zombie on a rope, his movements disconnected from any sense of balance. The decision to keep Thomas moving toward the summit was no longer about mountaineering. It was about a refusal to accept reality. The escalation had reached a point where the expedition was no longer a climb. It was a slow-motion train wreck. Lincoln Hall reached the summit at 9 a.m. on May 25th. In the photos taken at the top, he looks triumphant, but his eyes are vacant. He spent less than 20 minutes at the peak. He had fulfilled his 22-year dream, but the price of those 20 minutes was his life. The descent began almost immediately, and this is where the chain of death tightened. Within 30 minutes of leaving the summit, Lincoln's coordination vanished. He began to stumble. Then he began to crawl. At 700 meters just below the summit ridge, Lincoln stopped. He sat down in the snow and refused to move. When Sangay's Sherpa tried to pull him up, Lincoln didn't recognize him. The man who had mocked the warnings 10 hours earlier was now a screaming, thrashing weight. He began to strip off his gear. This is a classic, terrifying symptom of end-stage HACE known as paradoxical undressing. As the brain's thermoregulation fails, the victim feels as though they are burning up, even in sub-zero temperatures. Lincoln was unzipping his down suit, exposing his skin to the killing cold. Below them, Thomas Weber and Harry Kickstra had finally realized the gravity of their situation. Thomas's vision had not returned. It had worsened. He was now suffering from extreme exhaustion and the same neurological decline as Lincoln. Harry made the call to turn back just short of the summit. It was a responsible decision, but it was too late. As they descended toward the mushroom rock, Thomas suddenly collapsed. He looked at Harry and said his final words, "I am dying." Within minutes, he was gone. A man who had survived a brain tumor to prove he could climb Everest had died within sight of his goal. The news of Thomas Weber's death was radioed down to base camp, but the focus remained on the escalating disaster with Lincoln Hall. At 700 meters, the four Sherpas were in a desperate battle. They had spent 7 hours trying to move Lincoln just 100 meters. They had used up all of their own supplemental oxygen trying to keep him alive. They were now at extreme risk of dying themselves. The Sherpas were physically lifting Lincoln, dragging him across the sharp limestone of the ridge. He was no longer a partner. He was a 180-pound anchor. They were now in the dead zone for over 15 hours. Their own vision was blurring. Their fingers were turning black with frostbite. Through the radio, the expedition leader, Alexander Abramov, was listening to the gasps and the panic in the Sherpas' voices. He knew that if they stayed with Lincoln for another hour, he wouldn't be losing one climber. He would be losing 5. The fatal decision was no longer Lincoln's to make. It had passed to the men on the ground and the man at the radio. The order was being prepared. The ethics of the mountain were about to be put to the ultimate, most brutal test. They were standing over a man who had stopped breathing, whose pulse was undetectable, and whose body was beginning to freeze into the ridge. But what they didn't know was that while they were preparing to leave Lincoln, a third party was moving up the mountain, a group that would find what the Sherpas left behind. But that was still hours away. For now, the only reality was the cold, the silence of a man they thought was dead, and the instinct to survive. And then, at 1:40 p.m., the order came through the radio. Chapter 4. Asterisk. The catastrophe at 700 meters was not a sudden event. It was a grueling 9-hour disintegration of human life. By 10 a.m., Lincoln Hall had ceased to be a mountaineer and had become a cargo. He was suffering from the final stages of high-altitude cerebral edema. His brain was swelling so rapidly that the pressure was forcing his gray matter against the interior of his skull, short-circuiting every motor function and cognitive process. He was no longer Lincoln Hall, the philosopher. He was a terrified animal. Sangay Sherpa and Penba Sherpa were the two primary men tasked with his survival. For hours, they attempted a technique called short roping, where they literally leaned their body weight against Lincoln to keep him upright. But Lincoln wasn't just passive. He was combative. In his delirious state, he believed the Sherpas were trying to kill him. He fought them off, swinging his ice axe blindly and screaming into the thin air. This is the reality of the death zone that the brochures never mention. Trying to save someone who is actively trying to kill you while your own heart is beating at 160 beats per minute just to keep you standing. By noon, the situation moved from critical to hopeless. The group had reached the area near the Mushroom Rock, a prominent geological feature on the North Ridge. They were still 400 vertical meters above the safety of Camp 3. At this altitude, every minute spent stationary is a minute closer to death. The Sherpas' own oxygen bottles were whistling, the terrifying sound of the last few liters of gas escaping the regulator. They were now breathing the same ambient air as the summit, which contains only about 30% of the oxygen found at sea level. Through the radio, Alexander Abramov was presiding over a funeral in real time. He was at base camp, looking at a telescope and talking to the Sherpas. The reports coming down were grim. "Lincoln is gone in the head," Sangay reported. "He is not moving. He is fighting us. We are dying." Abramov was faced with the most brutal calculation in leadership. If he told the Sherpas to stay, he would be signing the death warrants of 4 young men, all of whom had families in the valleys below. If he told them to leave, he was abandoning a client who was still technically breathing. The decision was finalized at 1:40 p.m. Abramov gave the order, "Save yourselves. Leave him." But the Sherpas didn't leave immediately. This is a testament to their loyalty that is often erased in the Western narrative of this disaster. They stayed for another 5 hours. They tried to drag him. They tried to sit him up. They tried to force oxygen into his lungs. But by 7 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip. The temperature was plummeting toward -40. Lincoln's breathing had become shallow and erratic, the Cheney-Stokes respiration that signals the end of life. His eyes were fixed and dilated. When Sangay touched Lincoln's cornea, there was no blink reflex. In any medical textbook, Lincoln Hall was dead. The Sherpas performed the final, heartbreaking ritual of the high peaks. They salvaged what they could, the remaining oxygen sets that might help them survive their own descent, and they left Lincoln's body. They didn't just walk away. They anchored him to the fixed ropes so his body wouldn't slide off the 10,000-foot Kangshung face. They crossed his arms over his chest. They covered his face. They left him in the darkness, a frozen monument at 8,700 meters. As the Sherpas descended, they were essentially ghosts. They were so depleted that they were hallucinating. Sangay later reported seeing lights in the snow and hearing voices that weren't there. They reached Camp 3 late that night, collapsed into their tents, and wept. They had lost a client. They had lost a friend. And they had left a man to freeze in the most lonely place on Earth. The news was radioed to base camp and then immediately transmitted to Australia. Because of the high-profile nature of the Seven Summits expedition and Lincoln's own status, the news didn't wait for confirmation. The official word was out. Lincoln Hall, age 50, had died of altitude sickness on Mount Everest. In the Blue Mountains, Barbara Hall received the call. She had to sit her sons down and explain that the father who had promised to return would now remain a permanent part of the mountain. The mourning process began instantly. Tributes were drafted by the Australian government. Obituaries were pre-written for the morning papers. The narrative was closed. Lincoln Hall was casualty number 11 of the 2006 season. But while the world was mourning, a physiological anomaly was occurring on the ridge. Lincoln Hall was not actually dead. He was in a state of profound, cold-induced suspended animation. The extreme cold, which usually kills, had actually slowed his metabolic rate to a crawl. His brain, though swollen and damaged, was being preserved by the very temperatures that should have frozen his blood. He lay in the snow for nearly 12 hours, abandoned, without oxygen, and without a hat or gloves, which he had stripped off in his final moments of haze-induced delirium. What happened next is the part of the story that remains a mystery to medical science. At some point in the early hours of May 26th, Lincoln Hall woke up. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know his name. He didn't know that he was sitting on the edge of a precipice. He simply sat up. At 7 a.m. on May 26th, a four-man team led by American guide Dan Mazur was making their own summit push. They were moving through the thin morning light, focused on their breathing, when they saw something that shouldn't exist. There, sitting on the edge of the Kangshung face, was a man. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wasn't wearing a hat. He was unzipping his suit. As Mazur and his team, Andrew Brash, Miles Osborne, and Zhangbu Sherpa approached, the man looked up at them. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like a man who was casually waiting for a bus. He looked at Mazur and spoke the words that would become famous in mountaineering history. "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." The shock that went through Mazur's team was physical. They knew who this was. They had heard the radio reports the night before. They were looking at a man who had been dead for 12 hours. But as they looked closer, the horror set in. Lincoln's fingers were white and waxy, the sign of stage 4 frostbite. His nose was black. His eyes were wide and filled with the terrifying vacantness of haste. He was trying to change his shirt, convinced that he was in a warm room and that he was late for a meeting. Mazur was now faced with the exact same choice Abramov had faced the day before. He was at 8,700 meters. The summit was right there, within 2 hours of easy climbing. His clients had paid tens of thousands of dollars. If they stopped to help Lincoln, their summit was over. They would have to use their own oxygen, their own water, and their own strength to try and move a man who was clearly brain damaged. Just 10 days earlier, 40 people had walked past David Sharp as he lay in a similar state. The ethics of 2006 were on the line. The world was watching, though Mazur didn't know it yet. The catastrophe had turned into a miracle, but for that miracle to matter, someone had to decide that Lincoln Hall's life was worth more than a summit. Mazur didn't hesitate. He keyed his radio and called base camp. "Alex, this is Dan. You're not going to believe this. We found Lincoln, and he's alive." The silence on the other end of the radio lasted for 10 seconds. Then, the mountain erupted into chaos. The dying was over. But the rescue was just beginning. Chapter 5. Asterisk. The radio call from Dan Mazur hit Everest Base Camp like a physical blow. Alexander Abramov, who had already spent the morning coordinating the logistics of Thomas Weber's death and grieving the loss of Lincoln Hall, was speechless. He asked Mazur to repeat the transmission 3 times. He couldn't process the reality. He had ordered his Sherpas to abandon a dead man, yet that same man was now speaking and drinking tea at 700 meters. The shock quickly turned into a frantic, military-style mobilization. Abramov knew that if Lincoln Hall died a second time, after being found alive, the reputation of his company, and perhaps the ethics of the entire sport, would never recover. At the Mushroom Rock, the scene was surreal. Dan Mazur, Andrew Brash, and Miles Osborne had completely abandoned their summit bid. They had spent years preparing for this day and tens of thousands of dollars, yet they didn't even discuss the choice. They immediately began stripping their own gear to save Lincoln. They gave him their supplemental oxygen, their water, and their snacks. Lincoln, however, was in a state of high-altitude psychosis. He didn't understand he was being rescued. He sat on the edge of the 10,000-foot drop, legs dangling over the abyss, and argued with Miles Osborne about where his boat was. He was convinced he was on a dock in Sydney, not a frozen ridge on the roof of the world. This is the hidden cost of the 2006 season. While the media celebrated the miracle, the 3 men who found Lincoln, Mazur, Brash, and Osborne lost their dream. For Andrew Brash, this was his second attempt at Everest. He would never get this high again. They sat with Lincoln for 4 hours in the killing cold, keeping him from crawling off the edge, waiting for the rescue team to arrive from below. Their sacrifice is often overshadowed by the survival story, but without their decision to stop, Lincoln Hall would have been dead within the hour. Abramov's response was unprecedented. He dispatched 13 Sherpas from the lower camps, carrying oxygen, a stretcher, and medical supplies. This was the largest rescue party ever assembled at that altitude. Among them were the same Sherpas who had left Lincoln the night before. Imagine the psychological state of Sangay and Penba as they climbed back up the ridge they had descended in grief, expecting to find a ghost but finding a living, babbling man instead. When the 13 Sherpas arrived, the operation turned into a brutal, vertical wrestling match. Lincoln was still combative. The dexamethasone, a powerful steroid used to reduce brain swelling, was injected directly through his downsuit into his thigh. As the drugs began to work, Lincoln's cognitive fog lifted just enough for him to realize he was in pain. The miracle was now a marathon of agony. Because Lincoln couldn't walk, the Sherpas had to slide him. They used a piece of plastic and climbing rope to create a makeshift sled, dragging him over the jagged limestone of the North Ridge. The descent of the second step was the most dangerous part of the rescue. The second step is a 40-foot vertical rock wall equipped with a series of rickety aluminum ladders. To get a 180-pound, semi-conscious man down those ladders at 600 meters is a feat of engineering and raw physical strength that defies logic. The Sherpas had to lash Lincoln to their own bodies, backing down the ladders while his boots kicked uselessly against the metal. One slip would have sent the rescuer and the victim screaming down the north face. As they moved, Lincoln's physical condition was deteriorating in a different way. While his brain was clearing, his extremities were dying. The oxygen was being diverted to his vital organs, leaving his hands and feet to freeze. His fingers were already the color of charcoal, a sign of deep tissue necrosis. Every time he bumped his hands against the rock, pieces of frozen skin would break off. He didn't feel it yet. The cold had provided a natural anesthesia that was the only thing keeping him from going into hypovolemic shock. By late afternoon, the second phone call reached the Blue Mountains. Barbara Hall was told that her husband was alive. The emotional whiplash was catastrophic. She had already told her children their father was dead. She had already started the mourning process. Now she was told he was being dragged down a mountain and might still die of a heart attack or a pulmonary embolism at any moment. She was forced to live in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the radio updates that came every 30 minutes. Lincoln reached Camp 3, the very place he had mocked Dawa Tenzing's warnings, at dusk on May 26th. He was placed in a gammo bag, a portable hyperbaric chamber that simulates lower altitudes by increasing air pressure. For the first time in 30 hours, Lincoln was breathing air that felt thick. His recovery inside the bag was rapid, but as his brain regained its function, the reality of what had happened to Thomas Weber and David Sharp began to filter in. He was a survivor in a graveyard. The rescue continued through the night. The Sherpas, now exhausted beyond human limits, refused to stop. They knew that if they stayed at Camp 3, Lincoln's frostbite would claim his entire hands and feet. They pushed through the darkness, reaching the North Conal at 7,000 meters by morning. This is where the first medical professionals met them. Lincoln was a horrific sight. His face was a mask of black scabs and sun-blistered skin. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. He looked like a man who had been exhumed. At base camp, the atmosphere was one of grim relief. But as Lincoln was being loaded into a jeep for the long drive to Kathmandu, the questions were already being asked. Why was he left? Why did he survive when others didn't? And what was the true cost of the 13 Sherpa rescue? The survival of Lincoln Hall was a miracle of biology, but it was also a disaster of management. As Lincoln crossed the border into Nepal, he was entering a world that had already moved on to the next tragedy. But for the climbing community, the investigation was just beginning. They needed to know why a man who was declared dead was currently sitting in a hospital bed eating soup. They needed to know if the death declaration had been a convenience rather than a medical fact. The aftermath was not just about Lincoln's recovery. It was about the legal and ethical fallout for the Seven Summits Club. Thomas Weber was dead. David Sharp was dead. Lincoln Hall was alive, but he was a man who would never be the same. The brain damage from haste and the loss of his fingers were permanent reminders of the night he spent as a corpse. But the most damning evidence didn't come from the medical reports. It came from the survivors' accounts that began to contradict each other the moment the adrenaline wore off. The official story was about to be challenged by the very people who had been on the ridge that night. The bodies were still on the mountain, but the real battle over blame, truth, and legacy was just beginning. Chapter 6, Asterisk. The survival of Lincoln Hall did not result in a universal celebration. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of scrutiny that threatened to dismantle the commercial climbing industry. The investigation into what happened on May 25th began not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, led by the most respected voice in mountaineering, Sir Edmund Hillary. From his home in New Zealand, the first man to summit Everest launched a blistering attack on the 2006 season. He stated, "The whole attitude on Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top. They don't give a damn for anybody else who may be in distress." Hillary's criticism was pointed directly at the Seven Summits Club and the 40 climbers who had walked past a dying David Sharp just 10 days earlier. The investigation quickly narrowed its focus to a single, haunting question. Was Lincoln Hall actually dead when he was abandoned? Or was his death a convenient medical diagnosis made by exhausted men who wanted to go home? Alexander Abramov's internal investigation defended the decision with clinical coldness. He pointed to the reports from his Sherpas Sangay and Penba. They claimed they had spent 9 hours trying to save Lincoln. They reported that his breathing had stopped for 30 minutes. They reported that his pupils were fixed and dilated, a definitive sign of brain death. But when medical experts began to dissect these claims, the evidence didn't add up. If a man stops breathing for 30 minutes at 700 meters, his brain cells began to liquefy. He does not wake up the next morning and crack jokes about being surprised to see people. This discrepancy pointed to a terrifying reality. The death declaration was likely a result of confirmation bias triggered by extreme exhaustion. The Sherpas were so depleted, so desperate to survive, that they saw the signs of death because they needed to see them. This wasn't a malicious lie. It was a psychological collapse. But from a legal and ethical standpoint, it meant a living man was left to die because his rescuers were too tired to continue. The investigation then turned to the role of the expedition leader. Abramov had given the order to leave Lincoln based on radio reports. He never saw the victim. He made a life-and-death decision from the comfort of a base camp tent. Critics argued that the commercialization of Everest had created a remote control style of leadership where clients are treated as liabilities once they can no longer walk. The investigation into Seven Summits revealed that the ratio of Sherpas to clients and the amount of emergency oxygen available at Camp 3 was dangerously low for a group of that size. While the world focused on Lincoln, the investigation into the death of Thomas Weber, the blind climber, revealed even darker truths. Why was a man with a known neurological condition that caused blindness at altitude allowed to push for the summit? The evidence showed that Thomas's vision had failed long before the second step. The investigation suggested that summit fever had infected not just the client, but the guides. The desire to produce a triumphant documentary about a blind man on Everest had overridden the basic safety protocols that should have turned him around at 7,000 meters. Thomas Weber didn't die of an accident. He died of a preventable medical crisis that was ignored for the sake of a narrative. The contrast between Lincoln Hall and David Sharp became the central pillar of the 2006 investigation. David Sharp was a solo climber with no high-altitude Sherpas and no fame to his name. When he was found dying in a cave, 40 people passed him. Most claimed they thought he was already dead or that he was beyond help. Yet 10 days later, when Lincoln Hall, a famous Australian mountaineer, was found in almost the exact same state, a massive 13-person rescue mission was launched. The hidden truth of 2006 was that life on Everest had a price tag. If you were part of a high-paying, high-profile expedition like Abramov's, the mountain would be moved to save you. If you were a budget climber like Sharp, you were left to become a landmark. This ethical divide shattered the climbing community. The investigation proved that a rescue at 700 meters Quasable, Mazur and Abramov had just proved it. This made the excuses given for David Sharp's death look like what they were, a prioritization of the summit over human life. Conflicting accounts from the survivors added to the confusion. When Lincoln finally recovered enough to speak, his version of events differed significantly from the Sherpas. Lincoln remembered being conscious much longer than the Sherpas claimed. He remembered trying to speak and being ignored. He remembered the feeling of being tucked in by men who thought he was a corpse. This suggests that Lincoln may have been trapped in a locked-in state, conscious and aware, but unable to move or speak, as his team prepared to leave him for dead. The gaps in the official investigation were massive. Because Everest exists in a legal no-man's land between Nepal and China, there was no formal police inquiry. No one was charged with negligence. No one lost their guiding license. The investigation was largely conducted by journalists and rival expedition leaders. This lack of accountability meant that the same mistakes could and would be made again. The Seven Summits Club continued to operate, and the commercial machine of Everest didn't skip a beat. Expert analysis of the failures pointed to a quote-quote storm of ego and equipment. Lincoln had been using a specific type of oxygen mask that was known to leak at the valves. If he was receiving only half the oxygen he thought he was, his descent into haste was inevitable. The investigation concluded that the fatal decision wasn't just Lincoln's mockery of the warning. It was a systemic failure to monitor the gear and the physical state of a 50-year-old climber who was clearly redlining. The most haunting revelation of the investigation was the missing 12 hours. We still don't know exactly what Lincoln did during that night. Some evidence suggests he may have wandered away from the fixed ropes and then found his way back. Other experts believe he never moved an inch, and that his survival was a result of the mushroom rock, providing just enough of a windbreak to keep his core temperature from dropping below the point of no return. But as the investigation wound down, the focus shifted from the how to the why. Why did the Sherpas feel so little guilt? Why did the expedition leader feel his decision was justified? The answer was found in the culture of the mountain. In the death zone, morality is a luxury. The investigation concluded that until the number of climbers is limited and the, quote, summit at all costs mentality is dismantled, men like Lincoln Hall will continue to be declared dead while they are still breathing. Lincoln himself would later say that the investigation didn't matter as much as the internal reality. He had been to the other side. He had experienced the silence of his own death. But the hidden truth he carried was one of profound survivor's guilt. He was alive because Thomas Weber was dead. He was alive because Dan Mazur gave up his summit. He was alive because 13 Sherpas risked their lives to fix a mistake that should never have happened. The official story wasn't the complete story. Some truths were still buried under the ice of the North Ridge. But as the media moved on to the next season, the survivors were left to deal with the wreckage of their own choices. Chapter 7. Asterix. The return of Lincoln Hall to Australia was not the triumphant homecoming of a conqueror, but the arrival of a medical anomaly. When he stepped off the plane, he was a man physically and neurologically altered by the death zone. The most visible legacy of his night at 700 meters was the loss of his fingers. Every one of them had been claimed by frostbite, amputated to the second knuckle. He was a man who had built his life on his hands, climbing, riding, and holding his children, and now he had to learn to navigate the world with stumps. But the internal damage was more profound. The high-altitude cerebral edema had left scars on his brain. For years after the event, Lincoln struggled with short-term memory loss and cognitive stutters, permanent reminders of the fluid that had crushed his gray matter while he sat abandoned on the ridge. Yet, the legacy of Lincoln Hall is not found in his injuries, but in the radical shift he forced upon the mountaineering world. Before 2006, the consensus was that a rescue above 8,500 meters was a physical impossibility. Up there, you are on your own, was the mantra. Lincoln's survival and the selfless intervention of Dan Mazur's team shattered that excuse. It proved that the impossibility of rescue was often just a lack of will. Because of Lincoln, the climbing community could no longer ignore men like David Sharp without facing the charge of moral cowardice. The tragedy of 2006 forced the Himalayan Trust and various guiding associations to implement more rigorous oxygen protocols and communication standards. It led to the Sharp Hall ethics debate, which is now a mandatory part of training for many high-altitude guides. However, if we look at the mountain today, it is clear that many lessons were ignored. The fatal decisions that nearly killed Lincoln, ignoring warnings, prioritizing the summit over health, and the overcrowding of the North Ridge have only intensified. In the years since 2006, the number of climbers on Everest has tripled. The commercial machine has become even more efficient at dragging people to the top. But the underlying psychology remains the same. The same summit fever that blinded Thomas Weber still claims lives every season. The mountain is still littered with the bodies of those who thought their ambition was a substitute for oxygen. The survivors of the 2006 expedition carry the story in different ways. Dan Mazur, the man who gave up his summit to save a stranger, continues to guide, though he is often reluctant to cast himself as a hero. He views his choice not as a miracle, but as a basic requirement of being a human being. Andrew Brash, who lost his own dream that day, eventually returned to Everest years later and reached the summit. For him, the legacy was about finding closure with a mountain that had asked him to choose between a trophy and a life. The Hall family's legacy is one of bittersweet resilience. Lincoln spent his final years as an advocate for Sherpa welfare and a speaker on the philosophy of risk. He wrote a memoir, Balling Dead Lucky, which became the definitive account of the disaster. But the mountain has a way of claiming people even after they've come home. In a cruel twist of fate, Lincoln Hall died in 2012, not from the effects of altitude or frostbite, but from mesothelioma, a terminal illness likely caused by exposure to asbestos in his youth. He died at age 56, leaving behind a family that had already mourned him once before. His death was a final, haunting reminder that we are all just dead lucky until we aren't. But while Lincoln's story ended in a hospital bed in Sydney, Thomas Weber's story remains on the mountain. His body, like so many others, was never recovered. He remains a permanent part of the North Ridge, a silent witness to every climber who passes him on their way to the second step. His Vision 2006 project ended in total darkness, a cautionary tale about the intersection of disability, ego, and the uncompromising laws of physics. The final lesson of the Lincoln Hall disaster is one of accountability. We like to blame the mountain. We call it the Savage Mountain, or the Mother Goddess, as if it has the agency to kill. But the mountain is just rock and ice. It is indifferent. The disaster is always a human creation. It is built in the tents at base camp, in the boardrooms of expedition companies, and in the minds of men who believe they can bargain with the atmosphere. Lincoln Hall survived because 4 strangers decided that a human life was more important than a piece of rock. Thomas Weber died because that same realization came 3 hours too late. Why does this story matter beyond the world of climbing? Because it asks the ultimate question of the human condition. When the air is gone, when your life is on the line, and when no one is watching, who are you? Are you the person who walks past the dying? Or are you the person who sits in the cold and shares your last breath of oxygen? Everest hasn't changed since 2006. It is still cold, still thin, and still deadly. The bodies of the 2006 season, Weber, Sharp, and the others, are now just markers for the next generation of climbers. They are green boots and the blind man, geographic waypoints in a commercialized wasteland. The miracle of Lincoln Hall was a brief moment where humanity won, but as the queues for the summit grow longer every year, that victory looks more and more like a historical outlier. What do you think was the real cause of this disaster? Was it Lincoln's arrogance, the Sherpas' exhaustion, or a commercial system that sets people up to fail? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the ethics of the 2006 season. We are documenting the perspectives of this community to ensure these stories are never simplified into mere accidents. If you want to understand the deep dive truth behind the world's most harrowing mountain tragedies, subscribe and join us. We explore the decisions, the investigations, and the human cost that others gloss over. The mountain keeps its secrets, and it keeps its dead. Lincoln Hall was the man who came back to tell us what it's like on the other side. But even he couldn't explain why. Knowing the risks, we keep going back. The summit is just a pile of snow. The real mountain is the man sitting next to you on the ridge.